This is Brutality of WeAreChange.org here in Hong Kong, all in the backdrop as in the United States, my home country. People are fighting each other and pulling out guns for chicken sandwiches. Yes. And here in Hong Kong, people are not fighting for chicken sandwiches. They're fighting for something completely else. I don't know if you maybe might have heard of it. Obviously, we're here reporting on the ground because of you donating to our GoFundMe, and that's why in this particular video, I specifically wanted to talk about the possibility of martial law or an emergency rule being declared here in Hong Kong. I want to talk about some of the speculations about undercover police officers that some people say are responsible for the violence that's happening here, but overall provide a context, specifically also geopolitically, about the things that are happening here from a nuanced perspective that, of course, you won't hear on the mainstream media, combined with, of course, everything else that I'm seeing on the ground here on an independent media organization that is financed by, of course, you, the viewer, with you supporting us by buying t-shirts and saying enough is enough of the hooey and malarkey in our society, and I'm going to represent my discontent and let everyone know around me exactly how I feel unapologetically. So yeah, thank you everyone for purchasing t-shirts and allowing us to continue to make videos. Now, specifically talking about Hong Kong, I have learned a lot. There's a lot of little details that, of course, you're not hearing about. Of course, we all know about the 5 demands, but I specifically wanted to talk about the Hong Kong Police Department, which there has been a lot of conversation around, and having dealt with this particular police department, I kind of wanted to share my experiences with them. But it is very interesting to see this particular department in action because it raises a lot of questions for me. Now, I definitely think there has been a lot of videos and evidence showing the brutality of this police department with a lot of very aggressive, some would say even unnecessary police tactics that in my opinion have been unnecessary and very brutal, specifically talking about the latest incident that just happened a couple days ago when the supposed elite Raptor unit of the Hong Kong Police Department stormed a subway station and literally beat up and pepper sprayed unarmed civilians, including some civilians who had nothing to do with the protests, including this man who was showing his doctor's appointment, who was clearly one of the victims of the assault that took place on one of the subway stations here. Now, very interestingly, the police officers actually held a press conference surrounding their behavior, and when specifically asked about this incident in the subway, the police officer spokesperson represented and said that there was no beating, but that the, quote, police officers were enforcing the law. I don't know about you, but this really doesn't look like they're enforcing the law here at all, especially since women and older people were victims of this brutality, which I think is a very fair criticism. And because of that, it has been actually fueling the protests and motivating more people to come out, having the complete opposite effect that the police officers here in Hong Kong expected it to have. Because obviously when they thought they would brutalize people, people would become scared. And sadly, the protesters have come up with particular slogans around this particular tactic, ultimately saying and even spray painting on many buildings, if you burn us, you burn with us. And being here a few years ago, just like this Atlantic article points out with their title, from Asia's finest to Hong Kong's most hated, a police department that was once widely respected for its restraint and trusted by the population, well, that actually is definitely not the case anymore. And this is why one of the demands of the protesters is to launch an independent inquiry into the use of force by police. Now, it's also important to point out here that this is a very unusual situation that this police department has been kind of given. And honestly, I have to say they haven't been dealing with it in the best of ways, as there's even other video footage showing how they're pepper spraying themselves. Another video, this one's pretty ridiculous, showing a riot, well, it looks like a riot officer here running, tripping, and his fellow officer just decking him in the head with a baton. in response to one officer falling on his head. There's also this footage of sorry. And yeah, this kung fu fighting is yeah, definitely not something usual. And of course, there has been recently, just as moments ago, some conversation about police officers shoving journalists, using pepper spray in the vicinity of other journalists, and there has been some fair criticism with even, I mean, the worst thing that I saw was, and personally experienced, was kind of police officers aiming their less lethal munitions at journalists, which I was actually here on the ground as well, which forced journalists to duck. But honestly speaking, completely fairly here, my experiences with the Hong Kong Police Department have been not bad. It's kind of like they even go out of their way to give you access. A lot of times their approach is very hands off. A lot of times, even when I filmed the Viper teams entering the train station, it's important to note here that they came 3 hours after protesters and rioters destroyed that train station, and they came very late. And mostly when demonstrations and protests do happen, they don't look or approach the protesters. Even specifically at the airport, they waited a very long time until a group of riot cops came, and then they kind of stood there, let everyone know that they were there, approached quietly, and let everyone leave. It wasn't other tactics that we saw in the United States specifically, where people are kettled and then mass arrested. And it's important to see that kind of distinction here, because their approach is very hands off compared to a lot of the other protests that I've seen. And mainly when we see them shooting less lethal munitions, tear gas, that blue water spray thing that we were also there for, they're doing that in response to protesters moving in on their positions and also pushing the escalations, which is a very important distinction to understand here throughout all of this. I mean, there's even one particular incident, like right after shooting this video, I was able to walk around everywhere unimpeded. There was a bunch of puddles of water everywhere because the protesters broke the sprinklers, and there was water coming and flooding the area. And then walking around, police officers are literally coming up to me, running up to me, and like, hey, 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 hey. And I'm like, initially I was like, oh crap. But they're like, hey, there's a big puddle there. You want to walk over here so your shoes don't get wet. Literally, that's the type of interaction that I had with police officers. And obviously, as a foreign journalist, optics matter. I've been getting a lot of preferential treatment from the protesters and the police officers, which is important to understand here. And I honestly feel a lot safer than I would if I was in Paris, France, documenting the Yellow Vests, where the situation was way more chaotic, way more out of hand, and way more turbulent and violent. So here is actually one of the places that I actually do feel safe. That is until, of course, the emergency rule is put into effect, which I'm going to get into in just a little bit. But there's also been accusations about undercover police officers that are dressing up as the protesters and causing some of the violence. Now, it was actually admitted that the Raptor elite police unit did dress up as police officers and arrested what they deemed to be the more radical protest elements here in Hong Kong, as demonstrated by this video, where we see two people that look like protesters arresting a fellow person, a part of the demonstrations. Now, there has even been accusations that it is these police officers that are causing the violence in a kind of problem, reaction, solution procedure, which of course the police department officially denied this happening. But it's important to understand here that this has been a tactic that other police departments, specifically in the United States and also Canada, have been caught guilty and red-handed doing. So it's not out of the realm of possibility that this is happening here in Hong Kong, but personally, I did not see this happen, and I did see a lot of anger by legitimate protesters, and I did see a lot of people throw Molotov cocktails. Specifically on the protest that I was at, it was estimated that 80 Molotov cocktails were thrown at the direction of the police, which is a pretty significant escalation. And talking to the protesters, they are legitimately angry and furious. And there's even a particular tier of protester, the tier 1 protester that takes the most amount of risks, that is on the front line, and there is a lot of encouragement. There's a special system in play here that we're going to go over in another video on this channel that's not yet released, talking about how the protest actually worked, and it's absolutely fascinating. But when the tier 1 protesters that were deemed the brave ones walk through, there's literally entire support teams. There's literally people clapping for them as they go to the front line, where a lot of the escalations do happen from their particular side. Now, who's exactly doing it? That's another question, but I have not seen any evidence or anything legitimate to prove the speculation that it is somehow police officers speaking honestly. And this is why, because of these escalations, that police officers are calling the actions a catastrophe, and why there might be martial law or emergency rule set in play here, which is gonna change the game dramatically. But before we get into that, there's been a latest development with, of course, Hong Kong's leader, Carrie Lam, which the protesters are demanding she, of course, resign. And according to Reuters, she said in a hidden undercover audio video that she has very limited room to resolve this kind of political crisis that is engulfing the city and the unrest that is happening with, of course, the larger tug of war that's happening with China and Hong Kong. Allegedly, according to audio tapes from Reuters, she said, quote, "For a chief executive to have caused this huge havoc to Hong Kong is unforgivable. It's just unforgivable. If I have a choice, the first thing is to quit. Having made a deep apology is to step down." And obviously, Hong Kong and China have been approaching the protesters with a very hard-line approach, not meeting any of the demands, not even negotiating. And of course, Carrie Lam is still in power here in Hong Kong and is denying that she offered to quit over these protests. Now, these protests don't just affect the people of Hong Kong. They have bigger global ramifications, which are important to talk about significantly, which is why mainly you're hearing about these protests on the Western mainstream media. Now, of course, usually the coverage is kind of generalized. Usually it's set in a picture that works towards the betterment of U.S. Initiatives and U.S. foreign policy, which does need to be understood here. My kind of understanding is also, just because something does work in the favor of a U.S. initiative doesn't always make it bad. But then again, that's just a whole nother topic of discussion that we're not going to get into. But talking about geopolitically, the situation involves many different countries, including Taiwan, which the protesters here are urging them to, of course, get involved in this larger protest against mainland China. And if you know, Taiwan is a major U.S. ally, which the United States gives weapons to, which of course angers China greatly because of the historical context and greater conflict between China and Taiwan, with even China threatening to launch attacks on Taiwan to the dismay and displeasure of course, the United States. And these are all pawns on the foreign policy chess game that foreign policy directors are well aware of in the United States, and it's being part of bigger negotiations that are happening right now between the United States and China, specifically not just surrounding the trade war, but specifically talking about the larger insidious trap that's unfolding between the new emerging rising power, China, and the established power, the United States, where, of course, historically, such positions have led to conflict. We're not going to get into the specifics of that, but just look up the Thucydidean trap if you want more context to that specific reference that I just made there. But obviously, Hong Kong is on the negotiation table. A lot of politicians are raising their voices surrounding this particular issue, specifically around Hong Kong, which is very hypocritical. Because when there's other protests, a lot of major U.S. diplomats, a lot of major U.S. politicians keep their mouths shut. Specifically in France, specifically in so many other issues that I could bring up where there is civil unrest, there is suppression of protests, but the United States doesn't care about it. But now they somehow care about this one? No, they don't. They're using this as a pawn for a greater geopolitical directive. The protesters here are trying to, of course, get the support of the United States They have sang the national anthem. They have called for Donald Trump to get involved. And Donald Trump so far has not been engaging in this specific conflict. But you could bet your bottom dollar that behind closed doors, this is an issue that is negotiated, and Donald Trump is most likely threatening a tweet storm about this specific issue, and is going to make it a bigger issue to China, and it's one of the cards that's being played here. So obviously, this is a very complicated situation that doesn't just involve human rights, as the mainstream media tries to tell you that it's just about, because it's not. Now, it's important to understand here that these protests, again, from everything I've seen, from everyone that I talked to, these protests aren't going away. They're major. They're huge. The energy here is extremely strong, and everything thrown against these protesters has only made them stronger. So sadly, this is only going to escalate the situation, with many people saying that there will be a declaration of emergency rule. And if that happens, everything changes. You could bet your bottom dollar that journalists like myself who are here in Hong Kong will have our gear most likely confiscated and will be deported. Worst case scenario, we would probably get assaulted. I don't see anything else further than that happening, but that's just some of my speculations with the journalists that I talked to that are experts in this specific field. And when that happens, of course, the internet would be cut off. Police officers and military personnel from mainland China would, of course, enter from neighboring Shenzhen. Police would be able to do whatever they want, raid whatever house or building they want, without justification, without warrant, arrest anyone, and even use lethal force if they choose so. And this is a declaration of powers that is still open, and sadly, in my opinion, most likely will happen. Now, there's two specific strategies here that China could play. Specifically, even talking to some mainlanders, the strategy that I was told that mainland China is using right now is, of course, a strategy of waiting out the protesters, hoping that the protests create economic calamity, create a major economic problem, which will lead the Hong Kongers to stop these protests so they could somehow financially sustain themselves, since again many people here are also financially constrained. So one of the strategies by China is to wait it out, let the protesters create a lot of chaos, create a lot of economic turmoil until they get tired and stop protesting. But this strategy looks like, sadly, it is not working. China even economically has been preparing for this move for a very long time, establishing many economic resources and alternatives to Hong Kong in, of course, neighboring Shenzhen. Probably saying that wrong, but you have it here. Shenzhen, which is, of course, very close to Hong Kong and is becoming a major epicenter as an alternative to Hong Kong. And with China not being dependent as they used to be on the Hong Kong economy, they're kind of hoping that this problem goes away on its own. They're hoping long term that a lot of the Hong Kong residents do assimilate, do start speaking Mandarin instead of Cantonese. There's been a lot of turmoil over schools here even talking about changing the official language or learning Mandarin instead of Cantonese, which is the local language here in Hong Kong, compared to mainland China. And of course, the second strategy is what people are describing as bloody, as many Chinese state authorities have publicly said that the end is coming soon, and it looks like there will be a heavy-handed repression of the protests, which of course will have global ramifications. And this, of course, is set to happen mainly because many people believe that China would never allow such shame to happen to them, specifically on the upcoming October 1st, 70th anniversary of the founding of the People's Republic of China. That anniversary is coming up very soon, in about 4 weeks, and it will be a massive national celebration that is already planned to celebrate the Communist Party, and it would be huge shame, which is very important to the Chinese, if these protests were still going on during, of course, this national day. And this is why many people believe that the emergency declaration will be called for that, with these protests being squashed by then. But the situation is still very unpredictable. There are still very strong forces coming against each other. Which side will prevail? Well, that's very hard to say, but it's not looking that optimistic for the people of Hong Kong. But again, just like many other protest movements before them, many times protesters were called naive and they were actually able to achieve something. But again, that is still uncertain here. And again, what I'm trying to do here is give you the perspective that I'm hearing. Are there other individuals that do support China, that do live in Hong Kong? Yes, there are some. We heard of some. I haven't heard many of them. I haven't heard any of them, to be honest with you. But there is that kind of voice out there, which does need to be understood as well. But again, for the record, I have not seen that demonstrated to me here at all. But again, it's just my own personal experience that I'm going through here. Another thing that's important to understand here is that the track, trace, and database society is in full effect, as police officers have been doing a lot of random searches on many individuals, specifically identifying them, specifically searching them, and even taking photos of them and their identifications, even when they're just using public transportation, trying to, of course, track, trace, and database. A lot of significant leaders and spokespeople have been arrested. Some of them have been released. Even the students who didn't go to class, according to school officials, the list of their names was requested by mainland Chinese officials. But if one thing is clear here is that these people aren't stopping and they're not giving up. So what will happen next? No one really knows, but that's my take on it. That's what I've experienced. This is what I'm seeing. This is what I've researched. What do you think? Am I wrong on any of my context, on any of my analysis? Please let me know in the comment section below. I always appreciate hearing other voices, learning from you, the audience, and that's because I wouldn't be here if it wasn't for you guys. It was a GoFundMe. It was literally a GoFundMe that I very stupidly asked for very little, which you guys compensated for, which allowed me to be here, which allowed me to hire professionals, translators, fixers to give you this information. So expect a lot more high quality content on this specific channel. Subscribe, and again, love you guys. Stay tuned for more on WeAreChange.org.